The air hung thick and humid, a suffocating blanket woven from Spanish moss and the unseen breath of 1,000 stagnant pools. For 10 long years, the swamp had been a maw, swallowing secrets whole, digesting lives, and spitting out only silence. Then, one sweltering afternoon, as the sun beat down on the parched earth at the edge of the cypress-choked wilderness, that silence was shattered by a rustle, a subtle parting of the dense undergrowth that sent a shiver through the small, weary community gathered nearby. A figure emerged, not with the frantic desperation of a hunted animal, but with a slow, deliberate grace, as if the very swamp had exhaled him. He was gaunt, his skin stretched taut over sharp angles, but his eyes, deep-set and piercing, held an unnerving clarity, a quiet ferocity that defied his skeletal frame. His clothes were rags, woven with mud and decay, yet he carried himself with an undeniable, almost regal strength. A collective gasp, a choked whisper, rippled through the onlookers. Old Ma'am Alara, her hands gnarled like ancient roots, dropped the basket of pecans she had been sifting. Her eyes, clouded by age and sorrow, widened with a shock that momentarily chased away a decade of weariness. "Elijah?" she breathed, the name a fragile ghost escaping her lips. It was a name spoken only in hushed tones, a memory of a boy, a young man, who had vanished into this very swamp 10 years ago, presumed lost to its depths, devoured by its creatures, or worse, recaptured and brutalized beyond recognition. The man before them was not the boy they remembered, nor the ghost they imagined. He was something new, something forged in the crucible of absolute wilderness, a living testament to a freedom so profound it radiated from him like heat from a forge. His quiet calm was a stark counterpoint to their palpable astonishment, their fear, their dawning, terrifying realization that what they saw was not a specter, but a man unbound. The swamp, once a cruel symbol of death and disappearance, had become his forge, his sanctuary, and now, his silent herald of rebirth and liberation. To truly understand the profound shock of Elijah's return, one must first grasp the suffocating world from which he had fled. The journey into the depths of his past takes us back to the sprawling, sun-baked fields of the Hawthorne plantation, a place where the air itself seemed to hum with unspoken misery and the relentless rhythm of forced labor. It was a landscape defined by the stark contrast between the stately, columned manor house, gleaming white under the unforgiving southern sun, and the rows of dilapidated, mud-chinked cabins that huddled together in the quarters, their occupants bound by an invisible, unbreakable chain. This was a specific region where the rich, dark soil yielded bountiful harvests of cotton and tobacco, but demanded a human toll that far outweighed its agricultural bounty. Life on the plantation was a brutal, predictable cycle. From the pre-dawn call of the overseer's bell to the last fading light of dusk, every moment was dictated, every action monitored. The routines were etched into the very flesh of the enslaved, a relentless dance of planting, weeding, picking, and processing. Backs bent under the weight of the sun and the lash, hands calloused and bleeding from dawn until nightfall. Dehumanization was not merely an unfortunate side effect. It was an active, deliberate policy, designed to strip away identity, agency, and hope. They were not people. They were property, chattel, extensions of the land itself, to be worked, bought, sold, and disciplined as their masters saw fit. The social hierarchy was as rigid and unyielding as the iron collar of a runaway. At the apex stood Master Hawthorne, a man of cultivated cruelty, whose pious pronouncements masked a heart of stone. Beneath him, the overseers, often poor whites or ambitious enslaved individuals, wielded their power with a brutal efficiency, eager to prove their loyalty through ever-increasing severity. Then came the drivers, the house servants, and finally, the vast majority, the field hands, who bore the brunt of the plantation's merciless demands. Customs were strict. No talking back, no looking a white person in the eye, no gathering after dark, no learning to read or write. The constant threat of violence hung over every interaction, a shadow that stretched from the whipping post in the yard to the casual, brutal hand of any white person who felt their authority challenged. A misplaced glance, a slow movement, a moment of exhaustion. Any could invite a brutal punishment, a stark reminder of their absolute subjugation. Elijah, even as a young boy, had been a quiet observer in this suffocating world. His eyes, even then, held a depth that belied his years, absorbing every subtle shift in the master's mood, every flicker of fear or defiance in his fellow enslaved. He spoke little, but he saw much. While others might have openly wept or raged, Elijah internalized, his spirit a quiet forge, shaping a longing for autonomy that simmered beneath the surface. It was a dangerous desire, one that could not be voiced, barely even thought, for fear of its very existence being discovered and crushed. Yet it was there, a persistent ember in the darkness. He wasn't overtly defiant, but there were subtle acts, moments of quiet resistance that hinted at the steel within him. He would work just a fraction slower when the overseer wasn't looking, a silent protest. He would meet the master's gaze for a second too long, a tiny, almost imperceptible challenge that only he knew he had made. He would hide scraps of knowledge, a whispered word, a half-remembered song, hoarding them like precious jewels. These were not grand rebellions, but they were the small, secret assertions of a soul that refused to be entirely broken, seeds of a spirit that, even under the crushing weight of slavery, yearned for something beyond the horizon of the hawthorn plantation. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. The plantation, a sprawling scar upon the verdant earth, was a microcosm of a cruel world. Its foundations built not on stone, but on the broken backs and stolen dreams of countless souls. Within its oppressive confines, the dynamics of suffering were intricate, a complex web of power, fear, and the desperate struggle for a shred of humanity. Elias, even as a young man, had learned to navigate its treacherous currents with a quiet watchfulness, his eyes absorbing every subtle shift in the hierarchy, every casual cruelty inflicted by those who wielded the whip and the word. He saw the older grievances, the deep-seated resentments among his people, simmering beneath a forced veneer of compliance. There were the ingrained habits of oppression, passed down through generations, where the expectation of indignity became as natural as the rising sun. He remembered the story of an old woman, beaten for daring to hum a spiritual too loudly. Her voice, a gentle act of defiance, deemed a challenge to the master's absolute authority. That memory, among many others, etched itself into the very marrow of his bones, illustrating how the cracks in his spirit began to form long before his escape. Daily indignities were not merely isolated incidents, but a relentless tide, eroding dignity brick by agonizing brick. The arbitrary punishments, meted out for imagined slights or simply to assert dominance, were a constant threat that hung heavy in the humid air. A misstep in the field, a moment of perceived idleness, a glance held too long, any of these could invite the lash, not just to the flesh, but to the very soul. Elias witnessed the psychological warfare employed by the masters and their overseers, the casual belittling, the separation of families, the denial of basic human comforts, all designed to dehumanize and break the will. He saw how hope, a fragile seedling, was systematically stomped underfoot, replaced by a pervasive sense of helplessness. Internally, Elias waged a silent war. He tried to maintain a semblance of hope, to cling to the dignity that was inherently his, even as every external force conspired to strip it away. He would find solace in stolen moments of quiet, watching the distant horizon, imagining a world beyond the fences, a world where his body and mind belonged only to himself. These fleeting visions were his rebellion, his private refusal to be utterly consumed. The growth of disrespect was a gradual, insidious poison, seeping into every interaction. Elias recalled the master's son, barely a man, who had once promised him a small plot of land for his own garden if he worked extra hours, a promise Elias had poured his heart into earning, only for it to be casually dismissed with a laugh and a dismissive wave of the hand when the work was done. That broken promise, small in the grand scheme of things, felt like a deep cut, a stark reminder of the inherent worthlessness assigned to his word, his effort, his very being. There were moments of painful silence from those who could offer no help, the weary resignation in the eyes of his elders, a silence that spoke volumes of their own crushing despair and the futility of resistance. Elias saw the subtle yet devastating emotional aggressions, the way the mistress would pointedly look through him as if he were air, or the overseer's sneer that conveyed absolute contempt, a constant reminder that he was less than human, a mere tool for their profit. These were not grand, dramatic confrontations, but a series of small yet profoundly impactful episodes, each one a drop of acid on the already raw wound of his existence. He learned to identify the manipulative behaviors from those in power, designed to control and break the will of the enslaved. The false kindness offered just before a particularly arduous task, the pitting of one person against another to foster distrust and prevent solidarity, the casual threats disguised as warnings. All were tactics in their arsenal. Elias felt the continuous emotional corrosion, a slow decay of spirit that threatened to consume him entirely. The psychological toll of bondage was immense, a heavy cloak of despair that weighed down every waking moment. Yet within him, a growing desperation began to stir, a desperate need for something more, something beyond this endless cycle of degradation. It was a silent, fiery resolve, born from the ashes of broken promises and the constant soul-crushing disrespect. This desperation was not born of recklessness, but of a profound, undeniable realization. The life he was living was not living at all. He began to understand that the only true escape was not merely to endure, but to vanish. The thought, once a terrifying whisper, now resonated with a desperate, alluring promise. The air on the plantation grew heavy, thick with an unspoken tension that tightened around John's throat like an invisible noose. The small daily indignities that had chipped away at his spirit now began to escalate, transforming into overt confrontations that left him trembling with a suppressed rage. It wasn't just the overseer, Silas, whose whip seemed to crack with renewed venom when John's gaze lingered too long on the distant tree line, but also the master himself, Mr. Caldwell, whose pronouncements grew harsher, his demands more unreasonable. Caldwell, a man whose veneer of civility had always been thin, now seemed to delight in finding fault, in imposing arbitrary new rules that served no purpose but to assert his absolute dominion. John felt the weight of Caldwell's eyes on him constantly, a predatory scrutiny that sought to unearth any flicker of defiance. This heightened scrutiny wasn't imagined. John's quiet resilience, once perhaps overlooked, had become a thorn in Caldwell's side. The master interpreted John's stoicism not as endurance, but as insolence, a silent challenge to his authority. A trivial incident, a misplaced tool, or a moment of perceived slowness in the fields would ignite a disproportionate fury. John found himself singled out, made an example of, enduring public lashings or prolonged periods in the sweltering sun with insufficient water. Each punishment, designed to break him, instead hardened a core of resolve deep within his chest. He would clench his jaw, focus on a single leaf or a distant cloud, and refuse to give Caldwell the satisfaction of seeing him truly shattered. The pressure wasn't solely external. Within the enslaved community, a different kind of burden began to settle upon John. His growing defiance, however subtle, was a dangerous beacon. Some looked at him with a mixture of awe and fear, recognizing the spark of rebellion, but understanding the terrible price it could exact on all of them. Whispers followed him, hushed warnings about stirring up trouble, about making things worse. Older men, their spirits long since bent, would cast him pitying glances, their eyes reflecting the futility they had come to accept. Mothers would pull their children closer as he passed, a silent plea for him not to invite further wrath upon their already fragile existence. John understood their fear. He felt the invisible chains of their collective apprehension, a communal desire for peace, however false, over the storm he seemed to be brewing. He saw the fear in Martha's eyes too, though she never spoke it aloud. Her touch, when she could offer it, became more urgent, her glances more fraught with unspoken worry. She knew, as he knew, that something fundamental had shifted. The plantation, once merely a place of suffering, was now a cage with rapidly shrinking walls. The psychological atmosphere became suffocating, each breath a conscious effort against the weight of impending doom. Every sunrise felt like a countdown, every sunset a temporary reprieve from a catastrophe that loomed larger with each passing day. John felt himself being pushed, inexorably, towards an edge from which there would be no turning back. The decision, he realized, was no longer a matter of if, but when and how. The pre-rupture phase began with a series of errors, or rather deliberate cruelties, committed by Caldwell that stripped away any last vestiges of John's patience. The first was the sale of Thomas, a young man barely out of boyhood, who had been raised on the plantation and was a beloved figure among the children. Thomas had committed no offense, save for a momentary lapse in attention in the fields. Caldwell, in a fit of pique over a bad harvest, decided to make an example, selling Thomas to a distant, notoriously brutal cotton plantation without a moment's hesitation. The cries of Thomas's mother echoed through the slave quarters for days, a sound that tore at the very fabric of John's soul. It was a stark reminder of their utter powerlessness, a brutal demonstration that their lives, their families, their very humanity could be extinguished or severed at a whim. Then came the incident with the rations. Already meager, Caldwell suddenly declared a reduction, claiming poor yields and economic hardship. The enslaved people, already on the brink of starvation, now faced an even grimmer prospect. Children's bellies distended, their eyes grew hollow, and the adults worked with a desperate, failing strength. John watched as an elderly woman, too weak to continue, collapsed in the fields and was left there, ignored until nightfall. A simmering rage, cold and sharp, began to coalesce within him. He had endured much, but the systematic starving of children and the elderly, the deliberate erosion of their basic right to sustenance, was a line Caldwell had irrevocably crossed. There was no hope for justice within this system, no appeal, no mercy. The final straw, a cruel and calculated blow, came when Caldwell threatened Martha. Not physically, not yet, but with a chilling proposition. If John did not mend his ways and cease his troublesome attitude, Martha would be reassigned to the main house, a place where vulnerability was often exploited and dignity was routinely stripped away. The implication hung in the air, a silent, sickening threat that targeted the one person John held most dear. It was a direct assault on his deepest affection, a manipulative maneuver designed to break his spirit by threatening to harm what he loved most. In that moment, watching Caldwell's smug, satisfied smirk, John understood. There was no life for him on this plantation, not truly. There was only a slow, agonizing death of the spirit, or a desperate, dangerous gamble for something more. The decision solidified, cold and clear, in the crucible of that threat. He would leave. He had to. The path ahead was terrifying, fraught with unimaginable dangers, but the alternative was a living death, a slow suffocation that would consume both him and, eventually, Martha. His preparations began in secret, meticulous and driven by an overwhelming sense that he had nothing left to lose. He hoarded scraps of dried meat and hardtack, stolen from the kitchen when no one was looking, tucking them into a small oilskin pouch. He sharpened a rusty hunting knife he'd found years ago, honing its edge against a rough stone under the cover of darkness. He studied the phases of the moon, the patterns of the stars, the flow of the nearby creek that snaked towards the impenetrable swamp. Each night, after the exhausting labor of the day, while others slept, John would steal away to the edge of the woods. He observed the patrols, memorized their routes, noted the changing shifts of the dogs. He mapped the terrain in his mind, the densest thickets, the shallowest crossings, the hidden paths only animals knew. He learned to move silently, his bare feet barely disturbing the fallen leaves, his breath held tight in his chest. A profound calm settled over him, a strange peace born of absolute desperation. The fear was still there, a constant companion, but it was overshadowed by a fierce, unyielding determination. He was preparing for an irreversible act, a definitive break from the world he knew. He was preparing to vanish, to become a ghost, or to find a freedom that had, for too long, existed only in his most forbidden dreams. The swamp, once a place of terrifying tales, now beckoned as his only possible salvation. It was a promise of the unknown, yes, but also a promise of an end to the known horror. The night John chose to vanish arrived cloaked in a thick, moonless darkness, a heavy blanket that seemed to absorb all sound. A faint drizzle began just after the last bell, a blessing that would obscure his tracks and muffle the baying of dogs. His heart, usually a steady drum, now hammered against his ribs with a frantic energy, a wild bird trapped in a cage. Every shadow seemed to hold a watchful eye, every creak of the old timbers of the slave quarters a potential betrayal. He waited until the deep, resonant snores of the men around him confirmed their slumber, then moved. His movements were practiced, silent, honed by weeks of nocturnal reconnaissance. The oilskin pouch containing his meager provisions and the sharpened knife felt heavy against his side, a small anchor in a sea of uncertainty. He slipped out of the cabin, a ghost among ghosts, and melted into the deeper shadows of the outbuildings. The air was cool, damp, carrying the faint, familiar scent of wood smoke and damp earth. He skirted the edge of the fields, moving swiftly, his bare feet expertly navigating the uneven ground, avoiding the dry leaves that would betray his passage. The distant lights of the main house flickered, a symbol of the world he was leaving behind, a world of chains and despair. He reached the tree line, the familiar boundary that had always represented the edge of his known universe. Here he paused, a primal instinct urging him to look back, to imprint this final image of his former life into his memory. But he resisted. There was nothing there for him but suffering, no reason to linger. He pushed through the first dense curtain of foliage, the branches scratching at his face and arms, a small, painful welcome to his new existence. He followed the winding creek he had memorized, its murmuring waters a temporary guide in the oppressive darkness. Then, a distant sound, a shout, followed by another, more urgent. The alarm. It had begun. Perhaps a missing guard, a disturbed dog, or simply the dawning realization that one of their property was gone. Panic threatened to overwhelm him, a cold wave that tried to freeze his limbs. But John pushed it down, replacing it with a surge of adrenaline so potent it tasted metallic in his mouth. He ran, not blindly, but with purpose, deeper into the encroaching woods, following the creek's path towards the promised, terrifying embrace of the swamp. The shouts grew louder, closer, punctuated by the unmistakable, chilling sound of hunting horns, signaling the unleash of the hounds. Caldwell would spare no expense, leave no stone unturned. John knew this. His escape was an affront, a direct challenge to the master's absolute authority. It was an extreme decision, not just to flee, but to pursue with such immediate, brutal intent. The swamp, therefore, was not merely a destination. It was his only option, a desperate gamble against overwhelming odds. He plunged into the dense undergrowth, the ground beneath his feet growing softer, muddier. The trees here were ancient, gnarled, their branches draped with Spanish moss that hung like spectral shrouds. He heard the first bay of a dog, a long, mournful howl that sent shivers down his spine. They were on his trail, and they were close. He pushed harder, ignoring the burning in his lungs, the ache in his muscles. The air grew thick with the scent of stagnant water, decaying vegetation, and something else, something wild and untamed. Suddenly the ground gave way beneath him, and he sank knee-deep into cold, viscous mud. He struggled, pulling his legs free with a sucking sound, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. This was it, the swamp. The shocking revelation was immediate and profound. This was no mere forest. This was a living, breathing, hostile entity. The trees stood on stilts of exposed roots, creating a labyrinth of shadows and hidden pools. Water, dark and still, stretched in every direction, reflecting the oppressive canopy above like a shattered mirror. Strange, guttural sounds echoed from the depths, the unseen movements of creatures that called this desolate place home. The air was heavy, humid, thick with the buzzing of unseen insects. Every step was a battle, a test of will against the treacherous terrain. He stumbled over submerged roots, splashed into unseen ditches, his feet sinking into the soft, grasping mud with each stride. He could still hear the distant shouts, the frantic barks of the dogs, now closer, closer still. They were at the edge of the swamp, perhaps hesitating, perhaps regrouping. But they would come. They would follow. John knew this place was considered impassable, a place where runaway slaves went to die, lost to its depths, consumed by its secrets. For the enslavers, it was a natural prison, a boundary beyond which no human could survive. But for John, it was the only direction left to run. He pushed forward, his initial fear of the swamp slowly morphing into a grim determination. The cold, dark water, the grasping mud, the unseen dangers. They were terrifying, yes, but they were not Caldwell. They were not the whips, the hunger, the dehumanization. This terrifying labyrinthine wilderness was now his refuge, a shield against the horrors he had fled. But it was also his new, immediate adversary, a brutal, unforgiving crucible that would demand every ounce of his strength, every shred of his cunning. In that moment, as he waded deeper into the murky unknown, the last vestiges of his past identity, of the enslaved man named John, began to dissolve. He was no longer a runaway slave. He was simply a man, alone, confronting the wilderness, forging a new, terrifying, and utterly unbound existence. His life had irrevocably altered, the emotional trajectory shifted by the definitive break he had just made. There was no turning back, only forward, into the swamp's embrace. The chosen night arrived, a canvas of absolute darkness painted by heavy, low-hanging clouds that swallowed the moon whole. John moved like a shadow, his bare feet knowing every creak of the floorboards, every loose stone in the path. The air was thick and humid, heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying vegetation. Each breath was a prayer, each step a gamble. He slipped past the sleeping quarters, a silent phantom, his heart a drum against his ribs. The tree line loomed, a darker silhouette against the already black sky, and beyond it the swamp, an abyss of unknown horrors and promises. He didn't look back, not once. The faces of Martha and the others were etched into his mind, a burning brand that propelled him forward. He plunged into the dense undergrowth, the thorny branches tearing at his clothes, the unseen roots tripping his already weary feet. The sounds of the plantation faded, replaced by the symphony of the swamp, chirping crickets, croaking frogs, the distant, unsettling cry of a night bird. The immediate reality of the swamp was far more brutal than his darkest imaginings. It was not merely wet and dark, it was a living, breathing entity, hostile and indifferent. The ground beneath his feet quickly turned from solid earth to sucking mud, each step a battle against its grip. Water, cold and murky, rose to his ankles, then his knees, soaking his already threadbare clothing and chilling him to the bone. Twisted cypress roots, slick with algae, snaked across his path like grasping claws, threatening to send him sprawling into the black water. The air hung heavy, a suffocating blanket that seemed to press down on his lungs, making every breath a conscious effort. He pushed deeper, driven by an instinct more primal than fear, the absolute, unyielding need for freedom. Then came the sounds he dreaded most. Faint at first, carried on the humid night air, but steadily growing in intensity, the baying of hounds. They were on his trail, relentless, their guttural cries a terrifying anthem of pursuit. Panic, cold and sharp, threatened to overwhelm him, but he forced it down, channeling it into a frantic surge of adrenaline. He knew these dogs, knew their masters, knew the ruthlessness with which they hunted. Recapture was not an option. It was a fate worse than death itself. A return to a living hell intensified by the audacity of his escape. He ran, or rather, he thrashed, through the dense thickets of sawgrass and tangled vines, his body screaming in protest with every strained muscle. The swamp became a labyrinth, a dark mirror reflecting his own desperation. The first days and nights blurred into a harrowing, sleepless ordeal. He moved constantly, fueled by an almost insane terror of being caught. The dog's bark sometimes seemed impossibly close, forcing him to scramble up a precarious tree or submerge himself in stagnant water, holding his breath until his chest burned. His skin, already raw from the branches, became a map of scratches, insect bites, and festering sores. Hunger gnawed at his stomach with an insatiable ferocity, and thirst became a constant burning torment. He drank the brackish swamp water, unfiltered and foul, praying it wouldn't kill him faster than his pursuers. Every rustle in the reeds, every splash in the water, sent a jolt of pure terror through him, his senses hyper-alert, his body coiled for flight. He learned quickly the swamp's indifference. Alligators, ancient and silent, watched him from the shadows, their eyes glowing faintly in the gloom. Water moccasins, thick and venomous, coiled on submerged logs, their presence a constant chilling threat. Mosquitoes in buzzing clouds descended upon him, leaving itchy welts that merged into a single inflamed agony. The isolation was profound, a crushing weight that pressed in on him from all sides. He was utterly alone, a single vulnerable human against the vast, unforgiving wilderness, and against the relentless, organized pursuit of men who sought to drag him back into chains. Despair was a seductive whisper in his ear, urging him to give up, to simply sink into the muck and disappear. Yet amidst the terror and exhaustion, something new began to stir within him, a nascent, fierce sense of self-reliance, born of necessity and the stark reality that no one was coming to save him. He was discovering a brutal, intoxicating taste of an unbound existence. There were no masters here, no overseers, no whips, no arbitrary punishments, only the swamp, which demanded everything from him, but offered in return the terrifying, absolute freedom of its wild embrace. He was no longer John, the enslaved man, but simply John, the survivor. He began to observe, to listen, to adapt. He learned to distinguish the rustle of a harmless creature from the slither of a snake, the distant call of a bird from the approaching bay of a hound. He found fleeting moments of respite in hidden alcoves beneath tangled roots, or in the hollows of ancient trees. He scavenged for anything edible, tentatively tasting berries and roots, guided by instinct and a desperate hope for sustenance. His body, though ravaged, was slowly hardening, adapting to the relentless demands. His movements became more fluid, less clumsy, as he learned to navigate the treacherous terrain with a primal grace. The clothes he had worn from the plantation were now tattered rags, barely clinging to his gaunt frame, slowly shedding the last vestiges of his old life. Each tear in the fabric, each new scar on his skin, was a mark of his transformation, a testament to the brutal, beautiful beginning of his new, perilous reality. The immediate life or death stakes were clear: survive or be consumed, either by the swamp or by the chains from which he had so desperately fled. This was not merely an escape. It was a rebirth, forged in the crucible of terror and absolute solitude. The initial days were a blur of primal terror and raw instinct. John plunged deeper into the swamp, the dense foliage closing behind him like a hungry maw. Every rustle of leaves, every distant croak of a frog sent his heart hammering against his ribs. The trackers and their baying hounds were close, their cries echoing through the cypress knees and murky waters. He moved on pure adrenaline, forcing his exhausted body through waist-deep muck, over fallen logs slick with algae, his lungs burning, his muscles screaming. Sleep was a luxury he couldn't afford, snatching only brief, fitful moments of unconsciousness pressed against a gnarled tree trunk, his makeshift knife clutched tightly in his hand. Hunger gnawed at him, a constant, debilitating ache, but the fear of capture was a more potent driver. He learned quickly that the swamp was a world unto itself, indifferent to human suffering, yet teeming with life and hidden resources for those who knew how to look. His initial survival was a brutal education. He watched the raccoons fish, the snakes hunt, the birds peck at berries. He mimicked their movements, their caution, their intimate knowledge of the land. His first meal, a handful of bitter wild grapes, tasted like manna. He learned to identify the water moccasins by their distinctive swimming pattern, the alligators by their subtle ripples in the water. He dug for roots, some edible, some poisonous, learning through trial and error, his stomach often rebelling. The swamp was a master, unforgiving but thorough. He shed his clothes piece by piece as they rotted and tore, until he was almost naked, his skin toughened by sun, rain, and insect bites. His body, once strong from plantation labor, became wiry, lean, and incredibly resilient. Every muscle honed by the constant battle against the elements and the terrain. He moved with an animal grace, his senses sharpened to an almost preternatural degree. The fear of recapture slowly began to recede, replaced by a deep, abiding respect for his new home. The first year was a testament to sheer will. He found a small, dry hammock, a raised island of land amidst the water, and painstakingly built a crude shelter from palm fronds and interwoven branches. It was barely more than a lean-to, but it offered protection from the worst of the storms and a semblance of security. He discovered a patch of wild rice, carefully harvesting it, learning to pound the grains between stones. He fashioned a rudimentary fishing spear from a sturdy branch, its tip hardened by fire, and spent hours by the slow-moving streams, patiently waiting for his prey. He learned to set snares for small game, rabbits, squirrels, even the occasional wild pig that ventured too close. The swamp, once a terrifying labyrinth, slowly began to reveal its secrets, offering sustenance and refuge to those who understood its language. He was no longer just a runaway slave. He was a creature of the wilderness, adapting, evolving, becoming one with the primal rhythm of his surroundings. As the months bled into years, John's transformation deepened. The emotional scars of his past life, though never fully erased, began to fade under the relentless sun and the cleansing rains of the swamp. He stopped thinking of himself as John, the property of Master Caldwell. He became simply the man in the swamp, a being defined not by what he was forced to do, but by what he chose to be. Solitude, initially a torment, became a profound teacher. He spent countless hours in silent observation, watching the egret stalk fish, the otters play, the deer graze warily at the water's edge. He learned the intricate dance of predator and prey, the delicate balance of life and death that governed this wild domain. He saw reflected in nature a truth far simpler and more brutal, yet also more honest, than anything he had known in the world of men. There was no master here, no overseer, no arbitrary cruelty, only the law of survival pure and unadorned. His mind, once consumed by fear and resentment, found a new kind of clarity. He contemplated freedom not as an abstract concept, but as the very air he breathed, the water he drank, the ground beneath his feet. He was free, truly free, in a way he had never imagined possible. This realization was a slow, dawning light, illuminating the dark corners of his soul. He learned to navigate the swamp not just by sight, but by smell, by sound, by the subtle currents of the water and the whispers of the wind through the tall grasses. He knew every hidden gator hole, every safe passage through the treacherous quicksand, every patch of medicinal herbs. His body became a living map of the wilderness, his senses an extension of its intricate network. He had lost much, his family, his past, his very name, but he had gained something immeasurable, himself. There were losses, too, that shaped him. The initial, desperate hope that someone might come looking for him, not to recapture, but to save, slowly dwindled into nothingness. He had allowed himself to dream briefly of Martha, of a life regained, but the swamp taught him the harsh reality of isolation. He mourned the loss of that hope, letting it go like a withered leaf carried away by the current. In its place grew a fierce, self-sufficient resolve. He no longer feared recapture with the same intensity. The swamp had become his fortress, his sanctuary, and he was its undisputed master. His fear of men diminished, replaced by a quiet confidence born of having faced down nature's raw power and emerged victorious. He had stared death in the face countless times, a venomous snake, a charging boar, the ravages of fever, and each time he had found a way to persist. His physical appearance mirrored this internal transformation. His skin was dark and weathered, his hair long and matted, often adorned with bits of moss or leaves from his constant movement through the undergrowth. His eyes, however, were what truly held the story of his decade in the wild. They were deep-set, piercing, and held an almost primal intelligence, a quiet intensity that spoke of countless hours spent observing, learning, surviving. They were the eyes of a creature utterly at home in its domain, yet still possessing a spark of human introspection. He had become a phantom, a whisper in the reeds, a legend whispered among the few who dared venture near the swamp's edge. But he was more than a phantom. He was a man reborn, stripped of the shackles of his past, forged anew in the crucible of the wilderness. He had learned to craft tools, not just for survival, but for a semblance of comfort. He wove baskets from reeds, carved bowls from wood, and even fashioned a crude blanket from animal hides. These small victories, these acts of creation, cemented his sense of self-worth. He was no longer dependent on others for his existence. He was the architect of his own survival, the master of his own fate. The swamp had stripped him bare, then rebuilt him piece by agonizing piece into something stronger, more authentic. He had found a profound understanding of existence outside human constructs, a deep connection to the earth and its rhythms. The meaning of freedom had become tangible, not a distant dream, but the very fabric of his everyday life. 10 years, a lifetime in the wild, had passed, and the man who had vanished was gone forever. In his place stood a new being, a testament to the indomitable will of the human spirit, ready for whatever the world or the swamp might throw at him next. He was no longer running from something. He was simply being. But the question lingered, a persistent echo in the stillness of his swamp sanctuary. What now? Survival had been the driving force, the all-consuming purpose for so long. Now that he had mastered the art of living in this wild place, now that the swamp held no more terrors for him, a different kind of hunger began to gnaw at his soul. It wasn't the hunger for food, but for connection, for purpose beyond mere existence. The catalyst arrived unexpectedly, carried on the wind like a stray seed. One day, while tracking a deer near the swamp's edge, he overheard a conversation between two travelers. They spoke of war, of shifting allegiances, of a growing unrest in the land. They mentioned whispers of freedom, of men fighting for their right to self-determination. He couldn't decipher the full context, but the word freedom, spoken with such fervent hope, resonated deep within him. It stirred something he thought he had buried long ago, the desire not just to be free, but to live free among others, in a world where his freedom was recognized, not merely tolerated by the indifferent wilderness. He retreated back into the swamp, the traveler's words echoing in his mind. He spent days in contemplation, weighing the risks and the potential rewards of re-entering the world of men. The swamp had given him life, but it had also isolated him, kept him apart from the struggles and triumphs of humanity. Was true freedom possible only in solitude? Or did it require engagement, participation, a willingness to fight for a better world? He began to observe the world beyond the swamp more closely. He crept to the edge of the woods, watching travelers on the road, eavesdropping on conversations, piecing together fragments of information. He learned that the war was about more than just land and power. It was about ideals, about the very definition of humanity. He heard talk of abolitionists, of those who dared to speak out against the evils of slavery. He realized that the world he had left behind was changing, however slowly, however painfully. The decision to return was not an easy one. Fear, a familiar companion from his early days in the swamp, resurfaced. Fear of recapture, of violence, of the unknown. But the hope for something more, something beyond mere survival, outweighed his fear. He knew that he could not remain hidden in the swamp forever. He had a debt to pay, not to those who had enslaved him, but to himself, to the memory of Martha, to the countless others who still languished in bondage. His return would not be impulsive or reckless. He spent months planning, preparing, gathering information. He needed to learn the lay of the land, to understand the new power structures, to assess the risks. He crafted new clothes from animal hides, disguising himself as a simple hunter or trapper. He practiced speaking, his voice hoarse and unused after years of near silence. He needed to blend in, to appear harmless, until the moment came to reveal his true purpose. He chose his moment carefully. He would emerge near a small town, a place where he could gather more information without drawing too much attention. He would observe, listen, and learn. He would seek out those who spoke of freedom and justice, those who might be willing to help him. He knew that his journey would be fraught with danger, but he was no longer the frightened runaway who had fled into the swamp a decade ago. He was a man forged in the wilderness, hardened by adversity, and driven by a burning desire for liberation. As he walked towards the edge of the swamp, he paused, taking one last look at his sanctuary. He felt a pang of sadness, a sense of leaving behind a part of himself. But he knew that he could not stay. The swamp had served its purpose. It had given him refuge, taught him survival, and allowed him to reclaim his humanity. Now it was time to take that humanity back into the world, to use his newfound strength and knowledge to fight for a future where no one would ever be forced to vanish into the wilderness to find freedom. He stepped out of the shadows and into the sunlight, a ghost returning to the land of the living, ready to face whatever awaited him. The air was filled with the scent of pine and damp earth, a familiar comfort that would soon be replaced by the smells of human civilization. He inhaled deeply, steeling himself for the journey ahead. The swamp would always be a part of him, but it was no longer his prison. It was his foundation, the bedrock upon which he would build a new life, a life of purpose and freedom. The choice to leave the swamp, to shed the protective cloak of the wilderness, had not been made lightly. It was a calculated risk, a strategic move born not of desperation but of a quiet, unyielding purpose. He had spent months observing from the dense periphery the subtle shifts in the world he had abandoned. Rumors, carried on the wind and through the occasional unwitting traveler he silently shadowed, spoke of a fractured nation, of whispers of war and the slow, grinding machinery of change. He heard of abolitionist movements gaining traction, of the fragile hope for a future where his kind might breathe free. This was not the world he had left, a static tableau of oppression. This was a world in flux, a world that just might be ready for his return. His re-emergence was not an act of surrender to civilization, but a deliberate re-engagement, a challenge to the very system that had sought to erase him. He chose a market day, a bustling crossroads where faces were many and attention was fractured, yet where news traveled fast. He walked out of the tree line not with a swagger, but with the quiet dignity of a king surveying his domain. His clothes, crude but clean, were fashioned from tanned hides, his feet bare, his long, braided hair adorned with a single polished riverstone. The chatter of the market stalls, the cries of vendors, the laughter of children, all faded into an abrupt, stunned silence as eyes fell upon him. It was the elder, the same man who had identified him a decade ago, who first gasped his name, a name long unspoken, a ghost returned to flesh and bone. Fear, raw and primal, rippled through the crowd. They saw not just a man, but a specter, a living embodiment of the swamp's mysteries, a challenge to their understanding of life and death. Some recoiled, others stared, frozen in disbelief. But beneath the fear, in the eyes of the few who had known him, flickered something else: awe and a dawning, tremulous hope. He carried no weapons, only the quiet authority of one who had mastered himself and the wild. His gaze was steady, unwavering, meeting each astonished face with a silent question. "Do you see me now?" His presence alone was a profound act of justice. He did not need to speak of the horrors he had endured, nor recount the years of solitary battle against nature. His very existence, standing there, alive and undeniably free, was the most potent indictment of the system that had claimed him. The enslavers, those who had once owned him, those who had hunted him with dogs and whips, now faced an impossible truth. Their property, their chattel, had not merely escaped. He had transcended. He was no longer a runaway slave. He was a free man, forged by the wilderness, returned to claim his rightful place in a world that had tried to deny him one. The news of his return, whispered first, then shouted, spread like wildfire. It reached the plantation, a chilling echo through the grand house and the slave quarters alike. For the masters, it was a terrifying unraveling of their perceived power, a living testament to their failure to contain the human spirit. Their system, built on the premise of absolute control, had been defied, not just for a moment but for a decade, by a single determined man. For the enslaved, his return was a thunderclap of inspiration. It was a story told in hushed tones around fires, a seed of rebellion planted in weary hearts. If he could vanish into the maw of the swamp and emerge whole, then perhaps, just perhaps, freedom was not an impossible dream. His journey, from a nameless face in the fields to a legend of resilience, became a beacon. He embodied a different kind of justice, one not measured by legal decree or societal retribution, but by the sheer, unyielding refusal to be broken. He sought no vengeance against those who had wronged him. His presence, his undeniable freedom, was vengeance enough. He simply existed, a living monument to the indomitable will to be free. The scars he carried were not just physical, etched by thorns and sun and struggle, but emotional, the deep-seated memories of a life stolen. Yet, they were also badges of honor, testaments to every hardship overcome, every moment of despair vanquished. He stood before them, a man of profound strength, tempered by solitude and survival, a silent sermon on the enduring power of the human spirit. His re-entry into society was not without its challenges. The world felt loud, chaotic, and unfamiliar after years of swamp-born silence. He struggled with the intricacies of human interaction, the casual cruelties and unexpected kindnesses. But the man who had faced down alligators and navigated labyrinthine waterways was not easily deterred. He carried the swamp within him, its quiet wisdom, its deep patience. He found work, honest labor that paid him fairly, a concept that still felt profoundly alien and exhilarating. He learned to read and write, spurred by an insatiable hunger for knowledge, for understanding the world beyond the reeds and cypress trees. He never forgot the swamp, returning to its edges sometimes, not to hide, but to listen, to reconnect with the silence that had shaped him. He became a storyteller, his tales of the wild captivating those who gathered to hear him speak, not of bitterness but of the raw, beautiful struggle for life. The narrator, reflecting on this extraordinary journey, finds himself in a contemplative silence. This was not merely a story of escape, but a profound meditation on the very essence of freedom. It was a testament to the fact that true liberation begins not with the breaking of chains, but with the unshackling of the mind. Our protagonist, by disappearing into the swamp, had not vanished into oblivion, but into a crucible of self-discovery. He had traded one form of bondage for another, the servitude of man for the unforgiving demands of nature. Yet, in doing so, he had found his true self. He had learned that freedom was not a gift to be granted, but a state of being to be fiercely claimed and relentlessly defended. The cost had been immense. A decade of isolation, constant peril, the shedding of all he had known. But the reward was immeasurable, a spirit unbowed, a will forged in fire, and an undeniable self-made liberty that no man could ever take away. His legacy was not just survival, but the embodiment of hope, a living whisper that even in the darkest corners of oppression, the human heart could find a way to bloom. He returned not as a ghost, but as a legend, a testament to the enduring power of choosing life, choosing self, choosing freedom against all odds. His story, echoing through the generations, reminds us that the wild places within us and around us can be both our greatest challenges and our most profound teachers, leading us ultimately to our truest selves.